Good morning again. Getting back to the night sleep always helps. Again, just a refresher on last evening. This is, we borrow language all over the place. This is our meeting room. Meeting rooms have ebb and flow. If you want to get a cup of coffee, we'll get one, do whatever feels comfortable for you. This is not a sermon, so you don't have to listen to Rachel until she's done. Just be comfortable with yourself. I'm working on a book. Got a friend of mine who's pastor of a congregation where they have a lot of 25 to 40-year-old young couples. Most of whom have not gone to college at all. They're fine people. But it said, we know the Bible stories because we sat in church and the preachers talk about Bible stories, but we don't have any clue how things fit together. And I discovered that at college and teaching my midway class. I could tell you, who came first, Isaiah or Mark? They know about Mark, but they have no sequence of how things fall in place together. So she asked, because she wanted to do a Bible study with his parents, and she went out to look for what she could find, and she found two basic choices when it came to introductions to the Bible. One really good one is by Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman teaches in North Carolina. He's a good writer, good scholar, but it's 1/3 text and 2/3 footnotes. That's just not. That's what you do if you want to do something. And the other option is with all polite love and respect, is movie class, which turns out biblical studies with a certain kind of thing. So she said, Don, why don't you do one? Oh, it's so nice and easy, just write a book. So I started writing a book which I have, the working title is An Introduction to the Bible for Progressive Anabaptist Followers of Jesus. And so I started doing it. Started working on it. It's only about my fourth done. I've been at it 2 years. And she said, you're starting with Genesis? Well, yeah. That's where you start. You'll start with the book of Revelation. Hopefully you don't. He said, why don't you start with something better? Like Jesus. Well, okay, I'm thinking about that. But why don't we start with Genesis? What is Genesis trying to do? It's confusing, it's misleading, it's not accurate, it tells us stories that our head tells us we can't believe, but Grandma told us when we were kids we had to believe, and so you don't know quite what do you do, how does this take place? So, what's the logic behind Genesis? Well, there are a couple of ways that people look at Genesis to tell you what's going on. One is, it is God's explanation for those of us who were not there as to how the world came to be. And I grew up believing that. With all the right stuff, my parents thought that was the way it was, and here's how the world came. And our answer to the creation of the world was better than anybody else's answer about the creation of the world because God gave it to us in that way. So that we looked at that. But then I began in my adult years to read, bump into other kinds of things. And I began to discover that there were things in the Genesis account that you can't quite line up in a row like you can American history. You can't always do that very well either. And so I looked at and I read a book, I can't even remember the name of the book anymore, but this author argued that Genesis is not God's account for us of how things happen, but rather it is Israel's attempt to explain for itself, knowing what we believe about God, how it must have happened. do you have to do it? Well, here's the American storyteller that I mentioned last night. I'm not sure if this is exactly how it happened, but I know this story is true. Could we take that kind of understanding and dig into Genesis? I don't know if this is exactly how it happened, but what is the truth in this story that the people who wrote the story were trying to tell us? Well, the other one is, don't lose the message of the story by arguing over the details and how the story is told. But we like that. So, why do you have creation stories? Well, let's put Genesis into perspective. I'm going to ask you to hang with it. This, again, is in, all of you picked up way there. I'd like you to look at this and tell me, what do you see? What observations come to your mind as you look at this? What do you see there? Anything that just says, oh. Let me identify one thing. We have, there's a 200 and 100 off the end of on the right-hand side. Use your imagination. It's what? The span of time before Abraham is not there because that's generally kind of prehistory. We're not sure what was, how to read that. Can you do a comparison? What else do you see in relationship to Abraham and us? Because we're down here off a little bit toward the stained glass window in the year 2010. See anything else? In comparison and relationships and ratios, I hadn't thought about this one until I saw it on the, when I created this. All of a sudden it dawned on me. So it's why I put it the way I did. Something else there.
It's about the same span of time from Abraham to Jesus.
Exactly. And I hadn't put that in anyway. It's as far from Abraham to Jesus as Jesus to us. Almost exactly, give or take a couple of decades or 100 years, something like that. And that's interesting, because we tend to compact history so intently. We sort of think about a couple hundred years before Isaiah, what Abraham was, and then if you look at it, you discover Abraham generally. Now, one disclaimer. I can easily find 5 people who would say this chart is absolutely wrong. So be flexible with the dates. There are varieties of dates given, but 2010 to 1900 BCE is generally what we use for Abraham's dates. But be flexible. Oh, by the way, language that I'm using. Are you acquainted with, we always went with BC and AD before Christ on the down in academic circles now, and I would like to encourage it, because we should not expect Jewish people to identify their years in the year of our Lord Jesus when it's not for them. So we've come with BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, which is what used to be ABC. Just so you recognize the line. BCE is prior to Jesus, CE is after Jesus. Okay? Israel was in Egypt from about 1650, 1700 down to about 1240. And then comes Moses. 200 years after Moses is David. And when we get to David, that becomes a bit of a turning point in how we look at story accuracy. There are more details out of the life of David following that we trust for being, that's accurate storytelling, a lot of this. Rather than back in the 1800s of Israel, Egypt, and how you had the place, those are seen more as storytelling for us. Now, then you're down to Babylon, and you notice J, E, D, and P. Somebody will recognize this. There are, in the way the Old Testament See, the Old Testament did not come to us as a package. It got put together over the generations as Israel collected their wisdom. And we believe, many of us believe, that this was really done by Ezekiel during the time of Israel's stay in Babylon, in their years of exile. This was an experience for Israel that was new to them because all the people in Egypt were now gone by 6 generations. And they were in danger of settling into Babylonian culture and ethos. And Ezekiel, as a resident priest who got taken into captivity with the people, began to work at pulling together the stories and the history of Israel's faith to teach to their children in a strange land. And so we have to have some way of keeping alive the stories of our experiences with God and our history. And so they come here seeing, how did we understand God at work? And one of the questions we look at is, it becomes interesting then, why did Ezekiel select this story and not that one or that one? There was a collection process. The first one that got put together are stories, this would be generally Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, are stories in which, by the way, any of you live out in the country at all where you have the back 100 yards behind your house a little thing of water that goes by, a stream? What do you call that thing? A creek? That's a creek. It's a creek. Now, see, I come from Eastern Ohio. You don't have creeks. You've got creeks. Okay? Just remember that. And there are sections in Genesis and Exodus particularly where every time the word God appears, you have a particular word used. Yahweh. Jahweh. Yahweh. And so letter J for that. Then there are sections in the same book, and they get interwoven and intertwined, in which every time the word God appears, it is Elohim. E-L-O-H-I-M. Elohim. E. Now, see, if I were to tell you, if I'm going along, and every time I come, I talk about God. Not God, but God. What's that tell you? If I tell you a story about God, you're going to say, hey, that's German. And you can identify those stories would have German background. So that we believe that the J, Yahweh, God stories came out of this section of the country, out of this period of history. There are another collection of stories, the E stories, the Elohim stories, which came out of this section of the country. And Israel, and I say bless them for it, Israel or Ezekiel did not see any reason to try to harmonize those into one set of stories. They retained the Elohim stories and the Yahweh stories because they thought both of those represent the traditions of our faith, and we can handle diversity because the Elohim stories are slightly different from the Yahweh story. And the Israel became very comfortable with having two God story traditions. They don't conflict, but they don't harmonize exactly easily. If you read through, you'll discover God doing certain kinds of things and God doing different kinds of things in that process. That's where that J and E come from. And we believe those stories circulated as oral tradition. People told these stories to their kids for generations and generations. Carol's dad, neat guy. We used to live right next door to us years ago. And we would take our children over and visit with Harold and Maxine. And you weren't there more than half an hour before Grandpa started telling stories. And we learned an awful lot about Grandpa and Grandma through the stories that Dad children got a little tired of it because they said, oh, boy, not the story about the train. And I think someone could tell you the story about the train. It wouldn't be quite like Grandpa told it, but you'd recognize it. That's oral tradition, where things get passed on that way. D is Deuteronomy. It's during the reign of Josiah when they did some remodeling and attempt, and they found a copy of this book that had been lost for ages and ages. I mean, for a couple of hundred years. You pull it out, it causes a renewal in Israel at the leadership of Josiah and the discovery of D material. Then, see, that comes on, J and E got put together in one. And then D material got added to it. So now we have J and E integrated, interwoven with D, Deuteronomy added to the list. So you got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Then they discovered something. This thing came on the scene later on. We don't know where it appeared first. But later on they discovered there is a batch of material, particularly in Leviticus, which is really priestly material. How to run a worship service, how to keep yourself pure and holy, how to handle sacrifices, how to do this. It's not historical stuff. It's worship stuff. So they labeled it P, priestly. And it got woven in together. And we're not sure how, and I'm not going to debate the question here, how J, E, and P got woven together so that, don't try to sort it out. It takes more brains than I've got to sort this out. What's a P section? But you can find those who will identify it for you in this one. And that then became the Torah. The Old Testament, first 5 books, the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that's the core element of Jewish faith. Got put together in that process. Now, tell me again, what did you see if what I said could be reasonably close to accurate? By the time you got to Ezekiel, then you have this core material being put together. What questions does that raise? Any observations or comments? Oh, some of you are smiling. I'd love to know what's going on behind that smile. Anything just you wonder? Let me give you an example of what I mean. If Abraham lived down here at 2000, generic shot, 2000, and Ezekiel, 1,200 years later, is putting together these stories, they come out of tradition. I don't want to be sarcastic, but you're not going to tell me that we know what Sarah and Abraham talked about inside the tent 1,200 years ago. So what might this tell you? Well, understand it. Again? A bit of, oh, let's be kinder, a bit of theological insertion into the story.
That's what I meant.
Like I said, you know, and so we begin to develop a tradition that gets put into the difference between history, teaching theology, or theology being put into historic situations and stories. So it's a thing, worry less about the details of what Sarah and Abraham said to each other, and whether Sarah really did laugh and Abraham scolded her for laughing and all that. By the way, you know, in Jewish theology, don't be hard on them, we do the same thing. There is in the Torah, in the Mishnah, which is a collection of commentaries on the Torah. There's a story about women are liars. My opponent is all really sincere. But you know why women are liars? Because the text proves they are. How do you get a tradition going? What did Sarah do when the 2 strangers told Abraham she's going to have a baby? She's 100 years old. She's going to have a baby. And then Abraham jumps her case, and she's embarrassed, And she says, I didn't laugh. I said, yes, you did. Proof positive. Women are liars. Now, just imagine what it would be like to be taught that your wife is a liar, or to be the wife and have the tradition telling you you're a liar. Well, that's where traditions get started in the process. Now, scratch that whole life's 2 minutes because it's not true, but it's the way the stories got told in the process. So, 1,000 years after history, and then less, these stories begin to get put into written collected form with the purpose of providing Israel a collection of stories to explain their faith. How did we get to this point in what we believe? So, why then do we have Genesis stories? Why have creation stories? I'm just going to assume that you're aware there are a whole batch of other national creation stories. The Enuma Elish, the Gilgamesh epic, Israel coming out of Egypt and wandering on and through the land of Canaan, settling down among the Canaanites, bumped into, and then down to Babylon, bumped into a whole series of creation stories that nations created to explain how they got here. And I'm not going to go through them today except to tell you that the Gilgamesh epic and Enuma Elish are blood and guts, gore. Thankfully, television hasn't learned on it yet, but they can make them into a series. That's horrible stuff. And the Enuma Elish, the continents were created as a result of a war that went on between two gods, and the one god won the war and cut up the wife of the other god into 5 parts or 7 parts and spread those parts over the face of the earth, and that's how we got continents. They're terrible stories. Israel, bumping into these stories, said, that just doesn't sound like the way our God would operate. And they're saying, not how we think about God. They're saying they know. Let's allow them that. Let's look at the words. Our God would not do it that way. Our God would work at creation in a more creative way. And so they began to put together stories about the creation. And again, how many stories do we have about creation in the Bible? There's one in Genesis 1, and there's one in Genesis 2, and they're not the same. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us, as we think it tells us, that Israel was quite content with 2 separate traditions of stories about how the world was created. They are similar, very similar, but the orders are, and they kept them both because they didn't want to choose between this story and castigate that story. They said both stories help us to understand how we experience and see our God at work. And so, what do you learn from the Genesis stories? Let me define a word we talked about last night, just to define it again, very simply for you. A myth. A myth is not just a fanciful story about animals talking and things like that. In theological circles, a myth is a sacred story, a sacred truth, put into story form and language to express something that cannot be visualized in language or expressed in language. So myths talk about truth that cannot be conceptualized neatly, like, I think I'm right, that's east. You can prove that. But when you're talking about God, how do you prove God? For me, God is a faith statement based on sufficient evidence that makes me comfortable with it. But it's a faith statement. I cannot tell you what God is, where, and how, and all that. I can tell you the expressions or the experiences or the things that I see that I interpret as being the hand and the spirit presence of God. Somebody else might see it differently, and that's okay. So these stories get told together in that way. In Genesis 1, the humanity preference is seen as humanity is created last. The final of a conclusion of God's creation to the supreme event, the creation of human beings. In Genesis 2, that's flipped around. As a way of giving humanity priority, humanity was created first. And then the other things are put around in that way. These stories are not intended to be scientific stories explaining how the world came to be. If any of you watched Bill Nye, the science guy, on that debate with the manager of the Creation Museum just outside Cincinnati, who was recognized that. So, what do we learn from the Genesis story? Let me start first negative on the screen. I personally do not believe we learn how, in fact, it did happen. So that for me, I am not interested in debating 7 days or 7 eons or 7 periods or 24 periods or anything like that. I don't know. I'm quite comfortable with evolution as the forming of how the earth formed and came to be. Gardner was the man last night, was the scientist at NASA. For those that we have a scientist from Goshen who is number 2 at NASA, right? I worked on the telescope, the Webb telescope going to go to space. And he told us that the world, we need to be careful because the world is expanding. And the more the universe expands, the tighter the rubber band gets, and the time is going to come when the universe is going to re-collapse in upon itself. And I said, we got to be paying attention to this. Because in 13 billion years, this place probably will collapse. I take his word for it. But see, that's the way stories get put together in this. And Genesis is not intending to compete with NASA on how you do the creation storytelling. It's intended to tell us something about God. I think there are 4 things that I think are good to know. Number 1 is that God is non-violent. God creates by the spoken word, and God said, and it was. These early Jewish Israelite people already had a concept of a God who doesn't beat the living daylights out of his enemies or to get things done. God creates in this non-violent spoken word kind of concept. Secondly, God is orderly. Scientists have fun with it, particularly the Gilgamesh epic. Because in the Gilgamesh epic, you have things happening that couldn't happen because the stuff that those creatures have to have hasn't been created yet. Okay, they were putting the story together, they saw it, and they did. But in the Genesis accounts, there's a pretty generally decent sequence of events, and they see God is orderly. Now, remember, they back up again. It is not that they knew how it happened, but they looked around them and they saw this happens, is that you have a day and then it gets dark and then you have another day, and things happen that way. And they saw it as orderly and they told the story reflecting what they saw in the matter of the whole world all around. Third thing, I like this one. Because all of the other, and there are, we know about a dozen of these, I'm told we know about a dozen of these creation stories by the nations. All of them are nationalistic. God created us. Sorry about the rest of you folks. That's not the Israelite story. An Israelite story is God created by God, so that everything belongs to God and God participates in it and everything goes on. God, therefore, is not a national deity. And I wish some of you would write a letter to anybody in Washington and tell them that God is not on our side. Fourth, creation is good. Now, I'm sorry, I keep wanting to give you tests. After each step in the creation process, it happened and God saw that it was good. What happened after, in the story form, after God created human beings? Then what did God say? Whoops. Whoops, that's not good. You're right. Very good. Creation is good. And in the Jewish understanding of humanity, when God created human beings, it was very good. Do you believe that? I should hope so. I should hope so. You see, again, we get caught in Christian faith with a variety of understandings and interpretations of reality. And in the right end of Christian faith spectrum out there with fundamentalism. Fundamentalism argues the world is bad. And it's going to get more and more evil. Yesterday was the best day you're ever going to have because it's all going to come built in there. And it's going to collapse and we're going to pay for all our sins. And human beings are evil. And they need to be redeemed from their humanness. That's not Genesis. That's not Jesus either, by the way. In the Genesis story, human beings are good. It is good to be a human being. It is not good to abuse your humanness or somebody else's humanness or treat them as less than human. So human beings, we're a sinful bunch because we do dumb, stupid stuff to each other. But you don't have to be saved from your humanness, which is very, very popular right now in American Christianity. That we Christians are, that we human beings are bad in need of salvation. Therefore, we need Jesus to save us from who we are so that God can tolerate us being in God's presence again. It's insidious in the way it just has crept into how we see ourselves, how we see others, and we delight in stressing the evilness of everything. And I will grant you, without any argument, there is an awful lot of evidence out there that says human beings do dastardly stuff to each other. I'll acknowledge that. But that's an abuse and a misuse and a distortion of what it means to be human. Thus, I would like to stress, you'll hear it again and again and again, this concept that to be human is good. And calling of Jesus, sorry, I didn't say that. And the calling of Jesus is that calling of God through Jesus, calling us to be all that God created us to be the best that we can become. So we're being called to be a development or a fulfillment of our humanness, of what it means to be human. Because to be human means to care, to love, to share, to give, to tell all that kind of stuff. And the call of Christian faith is for us to tell people God loves them. And here's what we could become. It's not you evil, mean people. Get rid of it. Not that process. Now, let me back up. I'd like to stress that these are things that the Israelite people throughout generations said, given how we think about God, given our experience of God, given how our parents taught us about, here is how we think God must have created this world and this universe. And they saw God creating it. But here is how it must have happened. I'm not prepared to say that is how it happened. But I am prepared to say the tradition that I come out of says, we believe in a God who operates. And this tells us about how we experience God and how we see God to be. And I'm comfortable with that. I believe God is involved in the whole process of creation. But we cannot definitively make statements of fact about God's actions. God is a faith statement. And for me, it's a faith statement based on stuff I've been taught and learned and have seen. Now, where do we get our clues then? Where we get our clues is to move off beyond this, to what does Jesus do with this? What does Jesus do with the creation stories of Jesus, I think, portrays creation as being good, because he uses it continually in healing and other kinds of experiences in human beings, and he uses human beings continually to bring healing and hope and sharing his love. It would do absolutely no good for me to ask any of you to go outside and jump over the church. Even the old you couldn't do it. But Jesus comes along and says, you folks can tell the truth. You can love your enemies. You can share with other people, which tells me that Jesus believes that in us there is that potential that can be nurtured and guided and lived out in the process. Now, let's work backwards just a little bit. In this Genesis story, I've tried to build the case that it's good. How did we get into the idea that human beings are bad and evil? Other than the fact that we do bad, evil, dumb, stupid stuff. Just grant that. Let's work backwards. Because this is the way theology does sometimes works. We got this, and then we can build a case for it. If you believe in your theology that Jesus died to save us from our sinfulness, then you have to figure out how did we become sinful people who need to be saved from it. So you back up from Jesus as an act of God, saved us from our sinfulness. We became sinful by being human. When you were born, you were human and you were sinful. Now, think with me just for a second. What does Church of the Brethren, what do Baptists, what do Mennonites do with that? Can you give me any example or expression or experience which you could point to and say, we do not buy into that Genesis account which says being born makes you a sinful bunch of protoplasm, all that goes into us being persons. Can you think of anything? What would you use as evidence to say, I know that's out there, but that's not where we're at? Baptism. Yeah. Our daughter Miriam has an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, sweet as can be, but they're stubborn at times. Are not just argumentative, they're selfish. But we don't say they're sinful. We do not believe that to be a human being is sinful. We back up and look at it at the time in your life when we start making decisions about what I'm going to do with my humanness. At that point, we begin to say, aha, sin is a choice that we make of making right or wrong decisions about life. So that we need to be saved from our sins. We need to be corrected and guided so we live caring about each other rather than pushing people around like we do nations. Another one, even more powerful in a sense, if you're Orthodox Christian, can you think of another that would validate we do not believe being human is sinful? Your theology of Jesus? See, again, I'm picking on fundamentalism because it's the most public, visible expression of an understanding of faith. Again, I've got a lot of very good fundamentalist friends. We just disagree on how we organize faith. But see, fundamentalism really pushes the divinity of Jesus, stresses it very, very much. We had a speaker at a conference about 2 years ago in which he talked about the whole Jesus thing, and a couple of us said, but you got a word, oh yeah, Jesus was human too. Yeah, okay, and that's a way of kind of dismissing that humanness of Jesus. If Jesus was, as Orthodox Christian faith believes, fully human, as much as the divine presence was in him also, then you can't say that to be human is sinful. Then you have to do with the Jesus Christ. You see how back there those things get involved in how we think about our own stuff today. So then, if you go with human beings being sinful, then you got to figure out how do we become sinful. Well, sorry, it's easy. Eve betrayed or seduced or confused Adam with the apple sort of thing. And so you trace it back to the creation account where even there, the very first man and woman was sinful, and as a result of their behaviors, it gets into our genetic stream, and we are born to be sinful. Thus, we get caught in the dilemma on how we read Scripture. Do you read Scripture out of a theological perspective that says, here is God at work in our midst, calling us to be more fully what God intends us to be as we were born and created with the potential of all of us have as human beings, and you'll read the text one way. But if you see it as this world is on its way to hell, and we're pushing it along all the time faster and faster, and we are participants in it, therefore we are sinful and evil, and we can do no good, then you'll read the Bible in a very different way.
Are you not going to bring Satan into the argument here? Satan.
Not at this point yet.
Okay.
I will not personalize Satan as an individual. If you want to talk about the presence and influence of evil in the world, and call it Satan, fine.
No, but I thought you right away went to Eve. Did evil exist somehow, even at the creation point where it comes, where there's this God, if there's a good, God is love, God hate. God is good, not evil. Someplace there's an opposite.
Yeah. Someplace you got to explain. He's talking about where does Satan come into this? If back in the garden, Adam and Eve were actually created good, then how did evil get into that? And that was the snake and the serpent and that.
So the Genesis story goes way beyond creation. It goes in what happened when man was, trying to take the place of the man that God created.
You're right smack on target with the whole thing in this way. We believe that these Genesis stories, a lot of us believe, that these Genesis stories got put together and created and woven by Ezekiel collecting these traditions, putting together. And it is in Babylon, down here at about 580 to 550 BCE, when Satan gets introduced into Jewish history. You have very few references earlier than that, but with Ezekiel and with the Babylonian influence, which had an evil god, Satan becomes part of the storytelling. And so the storytelling puts that back into that and saying there are forces of evil doing battle with the forces of good. And it's borrowed, and it might be a legitimate borrowing. I don't know. It's a borrowing of a kind of reality of how you explain the presence of evil. You create this image of Satan in it when it comes to that. I want to be careful. Just like I don't put God as a physical human being, grandpa sitting up in heaven somewhere. I would not want to put Satan as the guy in the red suit with his tail. But acknowledge the presence of a force in our world that is driving us to do miserable things. Are we on the same page in that? At least in the same book. That's the same book. Okay. Now, let's move then. Hello, let's stop for a moment. What did you hear being said about creation today? Feedback to me. What's coming at you? Where?
I was just a little bit confused. Very little background in this. You said that Ezekiel was collecting stories in order to protect the Israeli
Their faith
their
package.
faith
Yes.
within this context of
Yes.
being exiled into Babylon. But then I thought I just heard that the idea of Satan came from the Babylonian culture, kind of where it might seeped into, where he wasn't successful at just bringing Israel. I'm confused about that.
The best I can do is give you what I read with Old Testament scholars and say that as Ezekiel was putting this stuff together, he is fully aware that over there in the Babylonian culture you have these evil gods as the explanations to why bad things happen. And in the telling of the story, he said, we've got to explain somehow the presence of the stuff that goes on in our world. And he borrows, and I think it's legitimate for him to do it. He borrows that concept and said, those forces of evil were also present here and how it got it. So he includes that in the storytelling package. Let me tell you just a quick story about this show something. 5 years ago, I'm sorry, I don't remember the time. About 5 years ago, our granddaughter, about a week before her graduation, was killed in an automobile accident. She was riding in the front seat of a VW when a Ford Explorer broadside her. She was killed. It was really a wonderful gal. At the funeral, the pastor made a whole lot of fuss about how this wasn't right. But you know, probably was a good thing because maybe Jen was going to do something later on in life that would have been terrible, and God was going to save her from that sort of. So God really made a blessing. You have to somehow make God responsible or fit into the problems of evil in the world. And like to it, it was a simple fact that two things happened that should not have happened at the same time, and they got in the way of each other. She swerved, the driver swerved to miss something, and the beat up, and the Ford Explorer swerved. It's called an accident. There are things that happen in this life. And I would not want to see God causing it. But I was really impressed with the way that faith community gathered around and said, we're all sick about this. And we're going to help it. And that's how we survive. Is by the faith community helping us to experience God hasn't quit on us because something terrible happened. And all of us have stories of things that happen in our lives that we wish would not have happened. But don't go back to the Genesis story and say that God who controls everything must have had a reason for causing it. God is into redemption.
This just a clarification for your question, and that is that Ezekiel was bringing together the stories preserved Israel's past, but Genesis was written at that time. So, two different bodies of...
A detail. Genesis probably was written and put into sketching notebook forms and the story forms before that. Ezekiel did not write Genesis, but he collected these stories and put it together. Is that fair enough?
So it was less put together.
Yeah. Ezekiel became the editor, collator of this stuff. Yeah.
You mentioned that many cultures have their creation stories. I think one of the most interesting creation stories is what our culture right now is working on a creation story. The physicists, the biologists are working on how we came into being. And it's an ongoing story. I expect it to last centuries.
Yeah. It's interesting because the physics model, which is called John Blosser. He keeps bugging me in an appropriate way. He said, Don, the most exciting theology is being done to the physics part. I think he's like really fascinating stuff.
There's modern-day philosophers.
Yeah, yeah.
Usted dice que Satanás usted no lo cree como cuernos y cosas, ¿verdad?
I heard you say that you didn't believe in a Satan that has like tail and horns, right?
Yeah. Is that image, that picture?
Sí. En el libro de Génesis, por ejemplo, nos habla que es a través de una serpiente. ¿Verdad?
In the book of Genesis, he appears as a serpent.
Ezequiel dice que cayó como un lucero del cielo. Parece que es Ezequiel que dice que cayó como un lucero de la mañana.
I think that in the book of Ezekiel is where it talks about him falling as a fallen
Fue
star.
bautizado.
Fallen angel. Yeah.
Jesucristo en el Nuevo Testamento dice que él fue tentado por el diablo.
And the New Testament says, speaks about Jesus being tempted by the devil.
Y inclusive sucedió una situación en lo que está escrito en el acto de los cegos. En el acto de los cegos. El acto de los cegos. ¿Verdad? Entonces esto, a mí, al ver esto, yo pienso que es o sea, al ver la Biblia, o lo que está escrito ahí, se puede manifestar.
There was a situation where the devil was manifested, or demons, in the herd of swine.
Yeah, or pigs. Yeah.
Entonces, si Satanás no existe como dice, entonces, ¿qué sería que, por qué es que está escrito la Biblia de esa manera?
So
Y yo quisiera dar mi cuenta, pues, cómo es que, si no es algo que está, ¿cómo me puedo decir? Visible, o algo que se puede manifestar, ¿cómo puedo yo entonces entender que el diablo no existe porque está escrito?
yeah, so what I'm struggling with understanding is if the devil isn't an entity that can be seen, experienced, or exercise power, how do we deal with that kind of, or combat that kind of evil?
We move away from taking even some of the stories of the life of Jesus as being literal, factual, historical accounts. One of the ways people deal with this gathering demoniac in the Gospel of Luke, who nobody can control this guy, and how do you prove to somebody that they're healed? Well, they can get up and walk. In this case, the guy's up and walking and functioning quite well, and you say, aha, see over there, those pigs? God shouldn't have raised pigs anyway, it was Jewish in the area. And the pigs stampede. Now, I'm not comfortable saying that there was inside this person, this demoniac, some kind of an evil spirit as a thing that dwells somewhere in us. And that left him and went into the pigs, and the pigs were self-destroyed. The message of the story is what evil does to us. Evil is destructive. It does all kinds of things. And somehow, Luke, in telling the story, had to deal with that purveyor of evil, which was a demon, in their language and understanding. And gave it that way of dealing with how to express, they're no longer in you, they're over there. And I'm prepared to pick that up, is that Jesus, that following Jesus, making commitment to Jesus, frees us from the stresses and pressures at times of doing things which are demonic to other people, without having to have something dwelling in me, I don't know what kind of language to use, like a cancerous growth that is a demon. I see demons as expressions of how to explain behavior of the first century that was not logically explained. So we give Mary Magdalene 7 demons. I see it trying to tell us what God does, how God operates in the face of evil. We get liberated and we get freed from it. And we don't have to allow those things to continue to work in our lives. Now, I want to back off just a half step and be aware that for a lot of people, what I just said is not an acceptable understanding. And I want to again say, if your own understanding helps you to be more compassionate and caring and loving, stay with it. Stay with it. Let's not argue over that point. Let's work together, healing and building houses and doing that sort of thing. Is that helpful? I'm not going to try to persuade you that you have to see it this way. But it is possible to believe in demons, and it is possible to not believe in demons and be followers of Jesus with the faith. Yeah.
I have two questions. I've always heard of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, and it's referred to as the books of Moses.
Yes.
What is his role in those first 5 books? And my second question is, these same books are the basis of Judaism. What's the Jewish perspective theologically of what we've heard about?
Second and first, it depends on whether you want to go into Orthodox Judaism or, well, let's Reform Judaism. Yeah. Just a quick one that in Reform Judaism, the Jewish rabbi in South Bend, Eric Soroka, we've become friends on a crazy kind of way. He keeps saying, "Don, why don't you come over and be a teacher in our synagogue?" And I said, "You can come to Goshen College and teach Old Testament." I mean, we have a lot of the same ideas about this. They would see that the presence of evil is all around us in the midst of us. He and I kind of have the same worldview on that. You don't have to personalize the forces of evil. They're insipid and they're in our midst and they're there and they're functioning and they are not categorically identifiable as objects. With regard to the books of Moses, I'm comfortable with the belief that Moses was kind of the instigator and the participant in a lot of these stories, which emerged then into the stories of the Exodus and those kind of things. And I don't think there was an Exodus. And I happen to think there was a lot of stuff that as we pointed back there, that happened, and then the stories grew out of it. Now, if any of you, I'm going to use another name, John Sheldon Spong, Episcopal priest, who is one of the more outstanding liberal thinkers and writers in our day. Spong and I disagree, by the way, we've met a couple of times. He says these stories, like the Exodus, are not factual data stuff. They are creations in order to make a theological point. I would much prefer to see, I'm not sure if the Israel marched 7 times around the city of Jericho or not. That's not relevant in my faith formation. But there was back there this kind of a kernel of truth. Something happened. The stories emerged. And the stories may not represent all the details, but I think there was a city of Jericho. I know about the archaeological background. The city of Jericho had been destroyed about 100 years before Israel got there, so that the walls didn't fall down. But that's the way they told the story and the celebration of God delivering them from the city which had an enormous reputation. It'd be like Moscow in our day, or Baghdad. This reputation for the residency of evil. And they get there, and it's gone. And they celebrate, and the story gets told that way, as God's liberation and protection of Israel. So that, well, I don't believe Moses wrote the books, the first 5 books of the Bible, but I see his fingerprints through it all. Others, I want to go on and take just a few minutes and look at the Pentateuch. And again, the point that we made before. Is the Pentateuch history being reported? Or is the Pentateuch theology being put put into storytelling form to communicate. I prefer the second, but I have a lot of really very good friends who prefer the first, and it's just really not worth arguing about in the process. Let's work at doing the stuff that the Pentateuch teaches us to be. Genesis, the Pentateuch, as we said, really becomes that foundation core of Jewish faith. It's built on that teachings of Moses. Oh, by the way, there's been a number of books put out recently would see, sorry, let me start that sentence all over again. There is a Jewish writing called the Clementine Preaching of Peter. It's a post-biblical document, which makes a very interesting statement. And it's not written by Peter, but it's put Peter's name to it, so it has authenticity, I think. And in these Clementine Preachings of Peter, Peter makes a statement, is, blessed is he who sees in Moses the hand of God. Blessed is he who sees in Jesus the other hand of God. Twice blessed is he who sees Moses and Jesus are the same. Not identical, the same. And what that text is trying to tell us is that we have picked far too many fights with Jewish brothers and sisters in the faith. That Jesus was saying a lot of the stuff that Moses said and bring it together. John Howard Whitney once told me in seminary that Don, don't think that everything Jesus said was original with Jesus. Jesus said a lot of things which came out of Moses and out of Isaiah and others. Put Jesus in the tradition of God's people, pointing us that way, so that we get on this path going that way, which is where God was calling Abraham to do. Isaiah was trying to restructure to make sure we stay on the path. Jesus says this, and then Paul's saying, now here's where the path goes. Keep it. If we look at it at that sense of continuity of faith, so the Bible brings this tradition to us of a direction that's taking us someplace, then we don't have to worry quite so much about who's right and wrong, rather it's what direction are you going on the path. So the book of Genesis is really a story of how Israel saw their history. It's the stories they wanted to tell their children about how our faith came to be, so their children would keep it alive. What we learn from Abraham is monotheism. Abraham, if you know the story at the beginning of Genesis 12, Abraham goes from here to there, to there, to there, to there, and everywhere Abraham goes, he discovers, experiences this Yahweh, God, is there. And Abraham then defies the cultural parameters of the day, that if you go north, as we be here, you go north, what is it, 200 miles to get to Canada or something like that? When you get to the Canadian border, you better change gods. Because in the ancient world, there's a different God for Babylon, a different God for Egypt, a different God for Canaan, a different one for Greek. And Abraham says, oh, our God is wherever I go. Not that he's there because I'm there, but wherever I go, God is there. And we pick up that concept of one God among the many gods. There is one God who is that concept. We also get a concept of God's concern for all people. Comes in Genesis very early. The call of Abraham was not because Abraham is such a good guy, boy, God says, I'm glad you're on my side. The call of Abraham was, Abraham, tell me. So the nations will all be blessed if they come to know who I am and what I want for humanity. So that Abraham is to be a channel of blessing for the nations, not just Israel. And also the premise in Genesis, because they did it a lot. When we fail, when we goof up, when we sin, it's a form of us saying, we're going to quit on God. but God never quits on us. That one runs through the story of Israel, the story of God's bailing out people in the Jewish story for the dumb, stupid stuff they do. Just runs through this God of redemption again and again and again and again. You kind of wonder, aren't they ever going to learn? Now, very quickly. These stories are not an historic accounting of what God wants for us. They are the people telling their stories about their experience with God and how that shaped their lives. And they did it so those stories would shape their children's lives and their grandchildren and hopefully us as well. Second book, Exodus. Exodus gives us the Ten Commandments. And check those Ten Commandments sometimes. It's interesting how many of them, in the story. Now, I want to just say it again because I want to make sure you catch it. I happen to believe there is tremendous power in storytelling. And a good story really grabs you and can impact the way you live. How many of the events in the Ten Commandments reflect Israel's life in Egypt? A lot of them. They didn't have a day off. Our God says, He did a day off. Our God says, down in Egypt, that the Pharaoh and the Egyptians treated the Jewish people miserably. And in the Ten Commandments, you don't treat people that way. You don't kill those people. You don't steal the property. You don't cheat on your spouse. All this kind of stuff. And it's the formation of Israel's faith compared to their past experience. And so, John Melton crossing the border group picked us up and said, here in this, Israel is making a choice. Are we going to be Egypt, reincarnated, or are we going to be God's people? And that becomes the dilemma that goes throughout all the rest of the Old Testament. Whose people are you going to be? Let me put it in modern terms. I tell people, I'm a Christian by confession, who incidentally happens to be American. Incidentally. I know a lot of people who are American. Oh yeah, incidentally, I'm a Christian. That's the dilemma that Israel struggled with throughout their whole existence. How are we going to be when we get to the land of Canaan? Will we become Canaanites, or will we be people of God? That's their dilemma. And so, you see in Exodus, God's concern, again, Israel's understanding of God's concern for every aspect of life. Here I'm the Israel I serve. He said, Don, you Christians really don't understand. He said, you call this the law. It's not the law, like the U.S. regulations saying you can't drive over 70. It's not the law. It is God's instructions of guidance for us to help us understand how God would have us live together. You understand what I mean? That's the way I understand Jesus. The teachings of Jesus are Jesus giving us God's best counsel that He has on how we can live together for the benefit of all of us. And the Rabbi says that the Old Testament law does four things, just real quick. One is it forms a human community. I think that's great. The formation of community is the essential of our faith. That it identifies the people of God and how God delivers and saves and guides. And Rabbi says, no, we're the same as you are in this way. We sometimes say God belongs to us, and you say God belongs to you. We both know better. But that's the way they experienced it in their storytelling. This is our God guiding us through their life experiences. Third thing, It takes on the shape of community in mission. This will come up again and again. The purpose of community is not the protection of community. The purpose of community is modeling and sharing so that other people can see and join or form new communities in that whole process. The purpose of church is not to protect the church. Back up a half a generation. We do not have to defeat communism in order to protect the church. That's just a bad thing. I think if the church were the church, communism might change some ways. And lastly, you get in this, in the law, a vision of the character of humanity that God is calling us to become. Look at the Ten Commandments not as walls around which we are around us and protecting us, but rather as guidance and instruction to call us, what could we become? What is the vision out there of what it can be for us? That's what shaped Israel's faith, these things. We're going to take a break. We're talking about prophet. Can you give me just a quick snapshot of what goes on in your mind about concept or idea of prophet? Yeah? Images or ideas of what you expect.
They tell the future and they're hated.
They tell the future and they are hated. Okay. Okay. So they are trying to express truth in today's setting that other people may not see. The prophets open a whole different world from the previous, quote, history world that we get into. They take a new approach to faith, and it's been said many times that it's no accident that the prophets begin to emerge after kings came on the scene. That the kings were a bit of the incentive taking prophets in the ear. If you contrast the message of judges, kings, and chronicles with the message of the prophets, you get a whole different sequence of how history gets shaped. Because, for last night, Judges, Kings, and Chronicles are not the stories you read to your kids. But you could tell the story of Isaiah. Isaiah's a really neat guy. And Ezekiel and Jeremiah, these people have some interesting parts about it. And a prophet in the Old Testament passages are people who usually says introduce a new way of thinking. I would rather put it, they try to reintroduce the old way of thinking. It's a restoration back to what Israel had been doing before. Now, you get the contrast then of we have on channel NBC News in Goshen a really good weatherman. He really is good, except he's wrong every once in a while. And he jokes about it too, because he said, we can only tell you what's out there, we can't tell you what it's going to do. We can tell you what the likelihood is of what it's going to do. And we tend to think of prophets as persons who are going to tell us what's going to happen tomorrow and what we should do about it. Well, I had a high school teacher, Loretta Greeneisen, who came to me one day with a prophetic statement. He said, Don, if you don't start turning in homework, you're going to get a D in this class. That didn't mean divine inspiration. It's just looking at the evidence of what you're doing, and not doing. This is going to be the result. I like us to think in that form for biblical prophets. Given our history, given what we are doing, it's going to be inevitable that is going to happen. And the king said, well, it's not because I'm the king. And the prophet said, yes, it is, because you're not God. It's that kind of a conscience of things. So I would prefer to think of the prophets as proclaimers rather than predictors. Now that means I've got to add one more quick paragraph. Particularly in Matthew. In Matthew's gospel, he does a lot of, and this was done to fulfill that which was written. And Matthew often goes back and finds things in the Old Testament which document the event in the life of Jesus that he's talking about. But Matthew has a tendency to say, this is what this guy was talking about back here. This is the fulfillment of this event. With all respect, I prefer to do that the other way around. I'm not sure the prophet back here really was talking about that. But after that happened, see, I told you it was going to happen. That's your mother speaking. That he went back and found in the prophets something that fits. And so he used it. That's a very valid way of writing. They did it a lot in that day, so it was the art of it. But they went back, after this event happened, and say, aha, see, there's someplace. And they go back and they find it and they quote it and say, this is the fulfillment of that event process. So that what the prophets do is to help us understand what justice is, what the people of God is. And they don't always have to have divine inspiration to know that. These guys knew their history. They were intelligent people who brought a kind of sensitivity and awareness to it. And most realistically, most of them lived among the people and had an understanding of what the people were like. Can I ask, you don't need to answer. I'm assuming most of you here would think of yourselves as pretty average, ordinary, common, everyday people. Fair enough? Do you know what, well, it all depends on how big your pool is, by the way. We're the richest 10% in the world. But just within ourselves, do you know what the average income or average net worth of the average person in Congress is? Virtually everybody. There are a few exceptions, but there are a very small minority of exceptions, are millionaires. And my problem is that these people think they're average, ordinary, everyday Americans. Because they hang out with each other, who are also millionaires. That's the movement that they live in and the way they function. And so is it any surprise? Our local congressman is a farmer, has a 2,000-acre farm. And he wrote a farm bill which cut food stamps for children and women, but retained subsidies for farmers. He's just helping the average ordinary person. Man, you know. And don't make him worse than anybody else. But that's, see, what the prophets did in that day was to look at that and say, hey, wait a minute. There's something going on here about justice and truth and righteousness and God's intentions. So, prophets dreamed of the way life could be. Now, who are your contemporary? Well, let it be. I would like to run this up a little bit. Okay. Holy night. Think with me. Those lines are supposed to be formatted differently.
Just a quick question. Are you saying that prophets are they're moved by their own interpretation, or they're moved by the Spirit of God?
I would not personalize or individualize that. I think these people had a kind. There are people that I see in the world around me that I just sense and know they have the divine intuitiveness that I don't have. And I see that as that ability to communicate, to respond, and think with the divine. I would put them in that category rather than, oh yeah, God, you told me I would remember that. Rather, they had a sensitivity to the history of God's experience in that way. Now, I picked out Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and Amos, and Hosea, and Micah. These are prophets, don't you know? Could you give me a contemporary Jeremiah? I know that's going to be tough. That's not fair for you. Could you? Do we have Jeremiahs in our world? What do you know about Jeremiah? One key to keep the prophet straight. Jeremiah stayed in Jerusalem. Put Jeremiah and Jerusalem together. Jeremiah stayed in Jerusalem, not by his own choice. Got to clarify. Babylon came in 586. Babylon was a burgeoning country with a lot of good stuff happening there, and they needed workers, and so they conquered Israel, came in and had a deportation in which they took off the top level. That would be the PhDs, the CEOs, and the CEs, and those people. Took them to Babylon to help run the economy. Ezekiel went into exile. Keep the EX together. Ezekiel went into exile, but tells us something about Ezekiel. Gifted, talented, Babylon saw him as valuable. About 3 years later, Babylon came back with their bulldozer, took off another swath of people. This was the managerial class. The people who kind of did the shop foreman work and the small business, they got taken over to help. About 5 years later, Babylon came back and took a third slab. Those were the working people, the working poor, sort of, the laboring force. Jeremiah never got took. Which tells us something about Jeremiah and how Babylon saw Jeremiah. He was not going to be a positive contributor to the Babylonian culture, so they didn't do so. Jeremiah stayed with the death and dying of the city of Jerusalem and functioned out of that category, kind of like a hospice nurse. Here, Mother Teresa would be a Jeremiah. Just telling us about how we have to treat the poor and the sick and the dying and the help in that process. And she's a general person. Isaiah. You have an Isaiah in your history. One of them, I have the guy is not living any longer. Isaiah was a counselor in the king's court. And he got so frustrated with what the king was doing that Isaiah resigned for a fair chunk of years. King changed, new king came and asked Isaiah to come back as a counselor in the king's court. You got any Isaiahs around here? We lost one just a couple of months ago. Nelson Mandela. Marvelous man with the sense of what he did. You lost one maybe 10 years ago? He was one of my I liked Mark Hatfield. I thought Hatfield had a conscience and integrity and he functioned. I don't know, it wasn't perfect, I assume. So, but he modeled something about leadership in political circles and that sort of thing. Those would be Isaiah figures in our day. What about Amos? Now, Amos is a kind of rascal in a way. Amos was he worked 2 jobs down in the valley of Tekoa, and they were miserable jobs. He grew sheep, not cashmere wool sheep, but scrubby feed sack sheep, wool, like that. And he went to Bethel to sell his wool. It was the stuff that you made servants' clothes out of, or garbage bags, things like that. Who would be an Amos in our day? You know anybody? Irritate the living daylights out of you. Call you names. Use language you're not quite used to in church. You know Shane Clyburn? Shane Clyburn. He's a young guy with a ponytail in the back and head, and he's not afraid to call a spade except when it's a shovel. Yeah, and we have people like that in that whole process. Now, I gotta just totally say this. I was talking with one of my friends in Goshen who was of a different political persuasion, and he said, "Sure, I know exactly what it is. It's Ted Cruz, Senator Cruz." I would say it differently, but be aware. We look at prophet figures, and there were kings who liked them. and kings who hated him. There were common people who liked him and those who didn't like him. Micah's an interesting character. See, you cannot put prophets into a mold. They just will not fit. Micah was a lawyer. He was a lawyer who filed a lawsuit against Israel for their behavior. And Micah in his process says, who's going to be the jury? The mountains. The mountains, because they have been here for so long, they have seen. And so he takes Israel to court about what they're doing and how they're living, and calls them and wins his case. Because he thinks he wins his case. Jim Wallace, possibility? We have one in Goshen that I admire. Carl Shelley. I don't know if any of you know Carl Shelley. He's pastor of the assembly. He's leader in the central district of John Church. And he's always looking at, okay, what are the implications of this? What does it mean if you do this? This is going to happen. And boy, you know, he has a good, clear, logical mind. Joel or Habakkuk. Habakkuk was a prophet. We don't know anything about this guy except his name. But he talked about why do bad things happen? And what do you do when bad things happen? And Habakkuk builds the case. What you do, if the mountains fall and the sea stops growing, you hang in there in your faith. You just stay with it. You don't let the stuff around you dictate how your faith is going to get shaped. One of my own personal heroes is Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was a Habakkuk who said, we are not going to let the nations determine how we live. We will not let them dictate our behavior. Even when bad things happen to us, we are going to continue to be the people of God. That was his essential message. And one slightly more difficult. How about Ezekiel? Ezekiel became a religious leader in Babylon. A marvelous, educated, sensitive guy. Has an unfortunate story. Ezekiel was a young priest and was planning to get married when Babylon came and took this top suite of the Jerusalem community, and Ezekiel got taken, his fiancée got left behind. And Ezekiel loved this woman very, very much. 3 years later, they come back, and this time Ezekiel's fiancée gets taken, and she joins him in Babylon, and Ezekiel just celebrates the joy of this, and they get married. And then about a year later, she contracts a Babylonian disease and dies. And one of the moving scenes in Ezekiel is when he goes out and sits beside a cemetery and says, "Is there any hope for Israel?" And you get the mixture of Ezekiel pouring his own heart out for that spouse who's buried there. And for the people of Israel, he's afraid, are we ever going to live again? Any of you remember Spike Jones? Spike Jones, God won't connect to the heel bone, heel won't connect to the leg bone. And that comes out of this Ezekiel 36 text, where Ezekiel sees bones coming out of the grave, new life, and where you get the concept of being born again that Jesus talked about. It comes out of Ezekiel 36, where Israel can survive, but they're not going to survive like the way they were. They're going to be a new people. And I'm going to put a new heart, not a heart of stone that doesn't respond to anything, but a heart of flesh into my people. They will be a living being. It's a beautiful, beautiful text. Look, I've got a whole chapter in the book on Ezekiel 36. I'm sorry, can I pursue that just to have it? Because it's very simple. I was asked after 9/11, we were living in Goshen, and I was working in Syracuse, Indiana, which is a very conservative town. And I was working at a retreat resort center. And they asked me if I would come down on the 12th, and do a devotion. And I went down and did a devotion on Ezekiel 36. Can anything good come out of this? Is there any possibilities of life? And I was arguing that if we would put our lives together in the way God would have us live, we might be able to reach out to people who do evil things to us, and perhaps chance to do it in a new way, in God's way. And I almost got run out of town. Because I was supposed to say, those people are evil and sinful and bad, and we are going to kill them so they can't do it to us again. That's not where I am. That's not where Jesus is. And this is a very Christian community. That's Ezekiel. That's Ezekiel down there in Babylon saying, how do we keep life on our faith alive? How do we make it do? You know what's better like Ezekiel? Any of you here, I'm going to back up a little bit. Do you remember Hubie Schwarzenegger? Hubert Schwarzenegger. Hubie lived in St. Louis. He wanted to get us in St. Louis as a pastor. He's just a saint of a guy who was, for those of us who are respectable, middle-class, church-going Mennonite people, Hubie at times used language that my mother would have not liked me to use as he described situations in St. Louis. But it was appropriate for the setting. Hubie Schwarzenegger was one who lived in the middle of a community that was dying. One of the slums of St. Louis said, we've got to build housing out here. We've got to find hope. We've got to do this sort of thing. Another one I would just suggest for you, a young woman who was in Chicago, Megan Raymer. Megan Raymer is providing leadership as a young woman pastor in an area of Chicago that is sort of falling apart. And she's building a community. She's a marvelous, marvelous person. Working hard, getting criticized all over the place all the time because she is not doing structural stuff the way structural stuff has always been done. She said, that's why God's here. See, the point being, I would like us to think about prophets not as weird creatures out there saying dumb things, but as people who live in our midst who are people like us who have the courage to say, look at where this is taking us. We've got to stop doing this. I was tempted. I probably shouldn't do this, but allow me. I was going to put Rachel Maddow on my list. I happen to like watching Rachel. But that concept of, do we have the courage to say, if you continue to do this, this is what's going to happen. And that becomes the prophetic figure. Now, where do you find the prophets? There are 15 minutes. Okay. The Old Testament prophets are a complicated mess in a way. There are people who are considered as prophets that you and I don't put in the prophetic books. Elijah, Elisha, they are the former prophets. Because they talk about how God relates to the situation of life that they're in. And so that gets put in as prophets. So you have these former prophets that you pick up in Elijah, about 10, 1100 years before Jesus. And then you get what we call the latter prophets. These are the ones that we know. They're not categorized that way. But there's a difference between major prophets and minor prophets. And please keep it straight and keep it simple. The only difference is the length of the book. Major prophets are not more important or more significant, just more wordy. They had good words. So you have Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Major prophets. And just to keep the record straight, there's a lot of discussion going on in the last 25, 30 years about Isaiah. See, Isaiah was a counsel in the king's court and then left in protest and went into seclusion for a bunch of years, then came back. And there was a discussion of whether is the book of Isaiah a single 66 chapter writing by one person, or is the first part of Isaiah, first Isaiah, and is there a second Isaiah? Now again, back off a half step on that, because Isaiah is not in the Bible because Isaiah wrote the stuff. And so it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter if it was a second person or a first person or one person, the whole thing. I tend to gravitate a bit towards being a different person because the language is different. A different set of words and things like this. Other people argue, well, he was in government, he was out of government, he came back 15 years later, of course he used different language, but so, okay. But recognize Isaiah as a sophisticated, articulate, beautiful, poetic, just by the way, he was Jesus' favorite. Jesus quotes from Isaiah more than anybody else other than himself. Now, these prophets, these former prophets, particularly and then the major ones also, they help us do a couple of things. They define for us what does it mean in simple living practice to be a people of God. They are less concerned about working out the details of what you have to do differently than telling you this is going to end up there. You need to repent and change your ways. But the prophets are more persons who identify what's going wrong. And the earlier prophets no, can't do it, sorry. Let's go back here. The earlier prophets, like Isaiah, tend to be more prophets who are saying we're doing it wrong. The latter prophets, like Ezekiel, tend to be much more, here's what we need to do right. Here's the hope that God has for us. Ezekiel is often called the prophet of hope, which is quite true. He's trying to explain to a community of people who have been deported and taken over by another nation, what does our future look like? And Ezekiel says, if we would reconstitute ourselves and start to again think about God and worship God and become the people of God, our future's not so bad. Ezekiel becomes much more in that way. The prophets did a couple of things. And I would just identify this. The prophets did stuff that we didn't arrested today. Can you imagine? I didn't do my politics, the governor of your state. Can you imagine him walking around Portland naked to protest the economic structures of the city? That's Isaiah. Isaiah said, you folks aren't getting the message. And so he walked around naked. By the way, in Israel, it was not sinful to be naked. It was sinful to look at a naked person without giving them clothing. Make sense? So you're not following the law of being naked in Israel. If you look at a naked person and say, look at it, then you're sinning. And Ezekiel walks around as a way of mentioning, this is what's going to happen to us unless we change what we're doing. And in essence, they didn't, and it did. They were carried off into captivity. Amos. Amos was a hard-working, two-job peasant farmer who went to Bethel. Now, Bethel is up in the northern kingdom. I try to think of a place to send Amos today, or the place where it's, okay, San Francisco or maybe Portland. Housing here in town is despicably expensive compared to what we pay in Goshen. You know, and Amos might come up here and tell you people, what are you doing to yourselves? Sorry. But Amos picks out a pretty severe, what he considers to be worshipful injustice. Where you live in, again, I'm acting innocently here because I really don't know. But you're surrounded by a sort of a middle class, maybe lower middle class area, I don't know what it is, social. And you decide, we're going to make a testimony to God's grace. And we're going to build a $5 million church building. Amos would say that's crappy. That is unacceptable. Totally unacceptable. That money ought to be invested in. He takes that kind of approach. He's angry, he's aggressive, and he gets himself deported from the country where he went up to Bethel. The king wanted to kick him out because he had the audacity to call the high priest, the priest's wife, a fat cow. Don't do that. That's not a good thing to do. But Amos became this person who saw the injustice that was being foisted on people in the name of God, and said, that can't be. Or Isaiah, brilliant, articulate, sophisticated, counselor of the king, wealthy. He talks about politics. Of course he does. And he talks about Israel. Come on, don't make this treaty with Egypt in order to defend yourselves from Babylon. Because if you do, and we beat Babylon, Egypt will take over. If we don't, then there's no winning in this kind of treaty negotiation stuff. And the king said, "Oh, I think it'll work. I think Egypt's nice people, And they made a treaty and got close. Jeremiah was a priest who really worked with the lower class people. And he kept talking about survival. How do we survive together in the midst of a world that is passing us by? And he would be talking, Jeremiah would be talking to those of us who are unemployed, those of us who are going to lose our houses in foreclosure, those of us who don't know where our next meal is coming for our kids and their shoes. That's the Jeremiah in our community. Micah was a lawyer. Hosea, pretty common, ordinary guy. We have difficulty with Hosea because the story of Hosea has him marrying a prostitute. And people tried offering hard because prophets shouldn't do that. And so they tried to figure out, was Gomer a prostitute in the temple, or was Gomer a poor Jewish woman who turned to prostitution? We don't know. So we kind of argue about it. But Hosea introduces something in the Jewish faith that is exceedingly important. Gomer has a painful life. His wife is always going out exercising her profession, and then she comes back home, she gets beat up and abused, and Hosea nurses her back to health. She gets back to health and makes promises how she'll never get the whole world, she's got to go again. And Hosea comes to the discovery. In fact, there was one time, he was so discouraged. They had two small children that he named really badly, not my child, God will curse you, kind of name. And he didn't know where his wife was, and he sent his two small children out to find their mother and get her to go back home. And Hosea comes to a stunningly insightful approach. Gomer is Israel. I'm not God, but Gomer is doing to me what Israel is doing to God. And Hosea just takes this and nurtures this concept of God as a loving, forgiving, merciful, accepting God, and kind of just dumps it into Jewish theology. And he had an impact on, not a dramatic, but a significant impact on how Israel thought about God post-Hosea. Where Gomer did bad stuff, and Hosea kept forgiving. Israel kept wandering off after pagan gods and other things, and saying, and God rescue us, and God forgives. See, the prophets were significant religious people with an insight into what religious faith is all about and what it should be. They were deeply religious. They remembered what God had promised. And they remembered it works. If we do these things, this will happen to us. If we don't, that will happen to us. And take that process. Yeah. The other thing they would worship people. I'm not sure. It's a good organization, so I don't complain too much. But we get Sierra Club mailings. I think Sierra Club is an environmentally pretty decent group. But they are a bit pathetic. Because they keep telling me about once a month, once every 2 months, that if I don't send them $5, 6 trees are going to die. Well, they might be right. They might be. But that would be the prophetic style. If you don't do this now, terrible things are going to happen to us. The world is going to fall apart, and the nation will cease to be. And lo and behold, the nation came awfully close to ceasing to be a couple of times. But they said, oh, we think we're doing okay. And the king said, okay. So, prophetic themes. What are they talking about? Now, no prophet talked about all six of them. But these become the kind of things that the prophets saw. These ought to be the underpinnings of Israel's life and people and nation. And I'd like you to think just for a bit. Where do you hear these themes being talked about today? The prophetic, the Shane Clyburns and the Brian McLarens and those people, the Robin Myers. These people are saying to people like me and to Rachel and to Rod and to Kurt, you guys spend far too much time caring about the people in the congregation who are there, and not enough time caring about how we as the people in the congregation are here can be compassionate and caring about the people in the city who aren't here. You know, they are clearly mission. Hey gang, I'm not going to tune anybody anywhere because I happen to like all three of you. But they, see, their point is, church tends to be a place of preservation rather than mission. And mission ought to be that which happens outside. It is that which happens outside. And if we are not impacting the community and changing the community, we're not being faithful. That's the concept of a deep sense of mission. Holiness of God. And then when we're done with these things, I want you to talk back to me. What do you hear being said? Because we need to get on to when we look at the War in the Old Testament. Holiness of God. Now, see, here I'm indebted to Marcus Ward. Has a book out on Jesus and the holiness of God. Ward argues, I think he's right, that the Pharisees in Jesus' day and the kings in Isaiah's day tended to say, we have to be holy and righteous. And the way we do that is to build a wall around our faith and keep those unholy and unrighteous people out. Because if we associate with them, they are going to infect us, and we will cease to be holy. I remember Brian Oxford years ago making a statement. What is wrong with us if we assume contact with somebody who is unholy is going to impact us? Shouldn't we impact them? Which is what Jesus did. Jesus continually declared people who were not clean, the blind and the lame and the lepers and all this, who in Jewish faith came not allowed inside the temple because they're not whole, not clean. And Jesus said, they are too, and he healed them. So that the symbolic meaning of the miracles of Jesus are less focused on the genetic changes in their seeing and their walking than they are in the impact. These people are made holy. And that's the task of the church, is to go out and reach out and make holy the community around us and those people whom the community and the nation and other religious people say are not worth it. And we take with us the value of persons in that way. So that it has a strong link with how God sees people. And you will find in Christian faith that today, people who want to insist that we have to stay away and not let any unclean people in the church. Yeah. 2, judgment for sin. This can be handled easily. The prophets tend to say what is happening is not just incidental, accidental stuff. What is happening is the result of our behavior and our actions, and we are getting just payment for what we're doing. And we have sinned, and sin has consequences. Now, I agree with that. I wouldn't always go back and pick up everything they saw as being sin, as what I would see as being sin. They were working in their culture, it was very valid. And a real direct connection between what we do has consequences. And they covered their message by saying, it might not be me, it might even be third generation, where what I do will be expelled out into the earth. 3, a call for renewal and trust in God. These prophets were really convinced that if we would change and we would become a people of compassion and mercy and justice and truth and godliness, then you would change. Things would change in that process. And our lives are not going to change unless we change our worship patterns, our living patterns, our style patterns, our belief patterns. 4, compassion for the poor. Social justice. Boy, the prophets had an insight of a world that was bigger than just me. And I get frustrated in our own country right now because we seem to be spending a great deal of time worrying about policies that protect people from high income up, rather than worrying about people who aren't going to make it. Without recognizing that these people don't make it, life's going to be more tough for me and for you and for all the rest of us because we're all impacted together. The prophets talk about compassion for the poor because the poor help provide that base for which all of us live and move and ever be. Hope. Ezekiel primarily hope. Things can get better. Ezekiel is not I can't think of the word I want, predeterminist. The things are inevitable. No, they're not. We can change. We can have an impact. And finally, the election. That one I just identified because the prophets were nationalists. And I would accept that. They were working within this culture, within this people, in this period of history. And they were talking about God's activity in this period with us as a people at this time and what we're doing. And so you will see them making very strong statements about God's people, us. And I won't do that because that's the world they live in. But their world was a bigger world than that. And God's people were supposed to be concerned about the rest of the world too. Questions, comments, real quick? I was introduced about a year and a half ago to a lawyer for the Tea Party Republican group in Elkhart County. And he and I meet together about once a month. We haven't met for a couple of months. We meet together and we don't even on the same planet. But he's a nice guy, he's articulate and friendly. We kind of like each other. And he argues with me on this question of war. It is the responsibility of the nation to be strong to protect our Christian faith. And I'm saying that that whole process is a denial of Christian faith. Go back and what we're going to do with David. David was a man of God. Let's take a look. What did he do with war in the Old Testament? Particularly when God told us to kill him. The problem is not so much of what they did, but the theological problem is they kept going back and saying God told us to do it. And God was with us when we did it. And we got blessed, and we got cursed when we didn't do it. Therefore, God is. Does the presence of war in the Old Testament invalidate our faith? Or does it validate war for us as a people? The problem for me is we are reading a flat Bible. We're reading the Bible, but no matter where you read it, it's all equally valid and impact. And so that we see war in the Old Testament is equally valid for us in the New Testament because God did it back there and we live in the same world. So it becomes a question. How do you read the texts? Let's see. How do you read the text? Well, one group says the texts are there. They're in the Bible. They are biblical. They are God-given. God is violent. live with it, and adjust your theology to fit. See, they would say that God is not only violent, but God supports and advocates violence in His name against other people as a way of protecting yourselves. My concern today, and as a pacifist, an active pacifist, it's easier for me because the state keeps trying to tell me who my enemies are. And I say, you can't do that. Sorry, you can't do that. I will not let you define how I see other people. National policy tends to take control of Christian beliefs. And so we adapt our Christian faith to fit the policies of the nation, which is exactly what Israel did as well. So, who speaks for God for you? Sorry, I shouldn't do this. This is page 19 in my book. But I think it's an important thing. I want to share it with you. It came out in a sermon. And I preached that sermon in a congregation, and there was a group in the congregation that went to the pastors and said, if God ever preaches in this church again, we're leaving. Here's what I said. Maybe you can go for 6 months. Here's the process that we go through when we move from being a people of peace to, if you're not pro-war, you're anti-God. Here's the steps. There are 6 of them. A, God is about salvation, redemption, and healing. Being peacemakers for God, lining you up with God. God is concerned about people being lined up with God. B, peace is a special thing that you teach as an ideal after you get people saved. So you got to get them saved, and then you give them the fine print. It's the second step sometimes for people. No, if you're a pastor, or if you're a nun, or if you're a priest, okay, you can be a little bit queer and crazy. You're allowed to be pastors. But the rest of us is unfit. C, peace is an optional, extra ethical choice. If you really want to be a radical, kind of, a Shane Clyburn kind of guy, you can be a pacifist. Go ahead. The rest of us who are logical and sensible, we're not going to be pacifists. We have too much smarts to do that. And if everybody was Shane Clyburn, where would our country be? We'd all be taken over by the Buddhists of the continent, not the Buddhists, they're pacifists, but by whoever. D, peace is an important part of the gospel, but it's an internal spiritual relationship with God. Don't mess up the biblical message by making peace an ethical assumption for politics. Peace relates to God. It has nothing to do with external political issues, or how we should treat Baghdad or Syria or any place else, because the stakes are high. And we are dealing with an enemy who is evil. And if that evil enemy wins, we will not be able to be good. E, war. Since that enemy is evil, war is the way to deal with evil. War is the only language those people understand. And if we're going to communicate with them, we have to speak their language. If we don't fight, you are going to be supporting them, not us. And lastly, because we know that God is on our side, don't ask me how we know that, we just know that. God is on our side. So we regularly ask God to bless us as we fight. And if you object to our fighting, you are not God. And how many times did you hear that in the 2 Gulf Wars? You cannot be patriotic. You can't be Christian if you don't vote, because we are Christians fighting against the evil forces in the world. See, I wonder about these because they have become kind of the innocent undercurrent mantra. And I'm going to make one, this is me, just me, I'm saying. My problem is not the soldier. Because the soldier has been taught in many churches, taught by massive American propaganda stuff to believe a certain way about God and told about God. My problem is with the government policy, and even worse, my problem is with the church and with our seminaries, who have taken over a kind of an approach that says we will accept national policy and adjust our faith to meet, when the church ought to, in my head, be standing up and down, jumping and screaming that this war, I don't care which war it was, this war is wrong and we will not participate in it. And that's going to be unpopular. But it just seems to me that that's the prophetic concept, and that's the Jesus concept. That Jesus is calling us to think differently about how we see people. And do we allow the nation to say who we love and who we don't love? Or do we hear the words of Jesus saying, people are out there, you love them. Now, they might not be nice to you. Jesus never says, if you silence your enemy, he won't shoot you. That's not a promise at all. But Jesus does say, if you love your enemies, God sees you as children of God. You count as children of God. And that becomes a part of it. So, that's one way to look at the text. And it's the call of the church to stop being afraid, well, that's not kind, to have more courage to stand up and say, here is how we see God at work in our world and in our lives. And we would like everything to persuade you to see it this way. And it might mean that we as Mennonite churches ought to get more involved with wounded warriors who come home as a way of helping them survive in this world, because I think I'm right. We have lost more Iraqi soldiers to suicide than we lost in the battlefields. Boy, that's someplace where the church ought to be offering hope and counsel and acceptance and food, that sort of thing. It's an area of mission that we have not seen very well. The second thing, the way the people read it, is we need to recognize that these are primitive cultures. That's the way they were. We're much more sophisticated now. We know about peace and justice. They were more like peace. And God, in God's mercy and grace, God relates to the culture. God doesn't say, you folks get smart and get to where I think, and then I'll like you. God comes down to where we are and relates to us in our human situations and tries to deal with us. So, don't be judgmental of them. God simply comes down and lets them understand. First, God's wars are less violent than the nations. So that the way God fought those wars are much better than the way Egypt or Babylon or Syria fought their wars. Now, Babylon particularly had a reputation for being horrific in their treatment of people. They really were. But what about the Exodus? And what about Gideon and some of these people? Israel was also violent in the ways they fought. Marcion, the guy who lived a couple hundred years after Jesus, he provided his own answer that the God of the Old Testament is not the God of the New Testament. There are two separate gods. Jesus said, oh, but the God of the Old Testament is a different God. And Marcion tried to go back and excise all the texts in the Old Testament that talked about war. So he threw out most of Judges because it didn't fit with Jesus. He was trying. Now, those are the ways people look at it. And I'm going to suggest down here that there's a better option. And we'll talk about it enough. I think it's such a, sorry, I don't want to be non-human. It's such an innocent, straightforward, honest, open option. You start with Jesus. Without apology, I'm a follower of Jesus, not David. In David's day, he was a good guy. He did a lot of good things, did some not so good things. But the way we look at this, I would like to start by asking, how did these texts get here? Why, out of all the texts of Jewish history that Ezekiel and the other collators of the Old Testament materials, all the texts that they could have used, why did they tell these texts? I wonder. I mean, they were written hundreds of years before, and they miss some particular themes. Now, my take. Ezekiel and the other collators of the Old Testament, because it wasn't just a one-person thing. They looked back in their history, and they saw things happening that they said, you know, for those to happen, and we're the people of God, God must have told us to do it. Let me tell you a quick story. I was a pastor back in Pennsylvania, and a young woman in the congregation came to me and said, effort prom is next week, and I've got a date for the effort prom, but my folks say I can't go. And they said, okay, you go talk to Dawn, and if Dawn says you can go, well, we talked about it, and I made it clear, let's call her Patricia, Pat, I am not telling you you can't go. I'm not going to do that. Let's talk about what would be the right thing to do and why you want to go. And we had a very good conversation. She went home and said, Don said I could go. I hope it's really crossing for you. But, you know, and I think Israel wanted so badly to validate what they were doing and explain why they won, sometimes there were really significant odds, that they said, God must have done that. Their beliefs about God was such that God takes care of himself. God must have helped us do that. And that's an easy step from there to God told us to do it. That's how they did it. And I would suggest that these Old Testament accounts of wars are Israel's projection into their history of what they wanted so badly that they created their own history. It reminds me a little bit of what was mass destruction in the Iraq War. Are there any better options? Yes. I wonder, do you know about these peace stories in the Old Testament? Peace things, Exodus 23. Sometime go back and read Exodus 23. If you do this, I will drive them out ahead of you. I will send locusts. I will send floods. I will send all kinds of things are going to happen. And they will be driven out ahead of you, and you will come in behind and take the land in peace. Well, unfortunately, Israel didn't do that. And they had all kinds of battles. But there's this theme that runs through the Old Testament. If you do things this way, I will provide. I will guide. I will do. And I think that's a reading of the Old Testament that we just don't recognize being there. Your enemies will run before you and turn their backs to you. That's Gideon. Remember Gideon? He pulled the neatest military stunt you ever saw. And it worked because in those days, you had a guy with a light and a guy with a sword, or a guy with a horn. And you put one in front of every battalion of 100 men. And that was your leader. And Ezekiel got this part out of it. We don't need 100 men. Let's just give all the 100 men a torch and a lamp, and they'll think there are 1,000 men instead of 100. And it worked, and it ran. And Gideon didn't respond quite as nicely as I would like to. But it's a case where God says, I'll drive them out ahead of you. And Gideon came close to doing it, and it worked. Or, another story, Elisha. Elisha's a neat guy. He's in a city, and the king is worried, the enemy king, is worried because every time he tries to do a sneak attack, Israel's army is already there. And he can't do it. And one of his counselors said, King, you know what's happened? There's a guy down there named Elisha. He has the ear of God, and God tells him where you're coming. So go get him. So they show up down here at this town where Elisha is. And Elisha prays, the Lord strike them all blind. And they all, the army struck blind, and Elisha goes out and says, who are you looking for? They said, we're looking for Elisha. Boy, it says, Elisha doesn't live here. Actually, Elisha didn't live there, he lived in the town. He said, here, I'll take you to him. And so Elisha leads this enemy force a couple of miles over to the city, moves them inside the city, inside the fortress, inside the city. This is, okay, Lord, let us see where they're at. And these guys discover they're surrounded by all of Israel's army, and they panic. And the king, unless it's a easy little hurt, the king says, oh, goody, can I kill him? Oh, boy, I got him, I'm going to kill him. And Elisha says, no, feed them. You know what the next verse is? The Amorites came no more into Israel. That shows up in the book of Romans, chapter 12. How do you treat enemies? Do like Elisha, feed them. Or, see, there's two stories in the Old Testament about how Israel conquered the promised land. One of them has taken a couple of months. They go into massive armies, but there's a second story, which takes about 14 years for Israel to settle in among the tribes, and they have little minor skirmishes, but they're not major battles like Ai and the other cities you had. And Israel moves in and settles in amongst these people, and they have some difficulty with foreign gods and stuff like that, but you don't have the major wars. And they manage to coexist. But I'm afraid that 10-1, we get the 6-month story of the battles and the judges and the gore and the blood, rather than a story of Israel just coming in and moving in amongst and claiming the land. There's two stories back there in how this stuff all happened. And then there's the quick one on David's census. David took a census. And there's another easily camouflage census. What he really wanted to know was how many men he had at fighting age. So he had an army. And David wanted to have a standing army, which is a neat word for army because they don't do much wrong when they're standing, when they go to war. And God comes down to David and says, that's wrong. That is not what you are supposed to do, and you're going to pay. Now, which is it going to be? A major famine, or are you going to get beaten in battle? And if I get the story right, David took the famine and 70,000 people died. And see, that story gets brought up a couple of times as God's intention that we should not prepare to do battle and plan for it as a military defense system. Well, what I wonder, what about Jesus? What about the Jesus option? Do we believe that you get a kind of progressive understanding of the nature of God throughout the biblical materials? So that we don't take a flat Bible approach and say, well, Jesus said, love your enemies, but judges say, go out and kill them all, and you get to take your pick of which one you want. We're followers of Jesus. And Jesus said, if you want to be children of God, you love your enemies. You pray for them. You do the Matthew 5:43-48 stuff. And Jesus comes along and says, I know this is what you have been taught. But I'm telling you, this is what God wants. Check the Sermon on the Mount. Verse 21, 27, 31, 33, 38. 6 times. Jesus comes along and said, hey folks, I know this is what you're being taught. I know this is what you've heard. Love your neighbor, hate your enemy, all that kind of stuff. But I'm telling you, that is not what God had in mind for us. That's not how God sees it. And Jesus then says, you love your enemies. Now, quick word, that doesn't mean you have to like them or want them for a neighbor or smile at them. That doesn't mean. When Jesus talks about loving your enemies, he's talking about that which would be good for them. And I'm amazed. John Paul Lederer. Some of you knew John Sr. John Lederer. His son John is mediator in the U.S. government. He goes around the world with it. He did a study of the Iraq War and the steps leading up to the Iraq War, and he identified 6 places where if we had taken a 2-foot step to the left rather than a 6-foot step to the right, we could have avoided that war. But we didn't do it. And he said, if we're going to be peacemakers, we have to be proactive thinkers, not reactive responders. And so, I recognize this. I'm a bit of a radical in this, and I kind of like being a little bit of a radical on it. But I wish the church, Mennonite Church, Baptist Church, whatever, I wish we could take a more intentional approach toward how we teach peace. Move it beyond how do we get out of Iraq. Move it into how do we treat our neighbors next door in this part of the city of Portland. How do we relate to the city of Portland? How do we work at reconciliation on the local levels and model that and keep making the circle bigger and bigger and bigger? I am modest enough to believe in the town of Goshen, for example, College Mennonite, North Carolina, congregation 500-600, that we're not going to change national policy. I think we can do something about the homeless in Goshen, and about the hungry in Goshen, and about the tensions that go on between the Anglo community and the Hispanic community. We have a large Hispanic minority community, and we're not communicating very well. Maybe we're going to be peacemakers at that kind of thing. And, you know, maybe if we did it in Goshen, maybe the governor of Indiana would get the message too and work it. And, you know, I'm a dreamer. But I just believe, sorry, I'm going to say it, but I just think Jesus makes sense. And that if we can start by how we see people next to us, we might be able to develop the skills to see how people relate who are farther away from us. My advice, God will tell us it. I'd like to see every congregation do some training in conflict mediation skills. Not that you'll all become conflict mediators, but I had a year of studies at Boulder, Colorado, in the Center for Dispute Resolution. It was John Paul Edward got me involved in it. It was a wonderful year when I learned to think differently, not react, but back up a bit and say, okay, no, what did he say? But what's behind what he said? How do I understand? What do they want? What would be good for them that wouldn't be harmful for me? See, I'd like us to be very intentional in our peacemaking, in our peace thinking, in our peace training. I find it a sad commentary. I really do find it sad. The biggest reason people are leaving the Mennonite Church, you know what it is? The board has done some studies on it. Our peace position. People don't want to take it. We're losing our peace position because it affects our business people in the community, our standings in the school systems, and it makes us odd. And more people are leaving the Mennonite Church to get away from our peace position than any other single reason. The other half of that, more people are joining the Mennonite Church because of our peace position. People are saying, this is quick, and then we'll have to open for discussion. About 5 years ago, I think it was, I was over here at Trinity Episcopal. Marcus Gordon was on that cross over there. Carolyn saw this ad in the Christian Century. Radical discipleship in a new age. Marcus Gordon, John on that cross. And I happen to like the word, so I came out here for a week and sat through more Anabaptist theology in a week than I've ever heard anywhere else in my life. Jesus meant what he said. And we have to find ways to move beyond believing in Jesus to doing the Jesus stuff. And it was fun. I got an ego. You didn't know. And I was sitting there, and we were surrounded with about 300 pastors and religious leaders at Trinity for this course. And these people said, man, why haven't we heard this before? Who's somebody to come in? Why didn't somebody tell them? I'm saying, this is what happened. We know all this now. And then it dawned on me. Remembrance of a comment made by my supervisor in Scotland, Matthew Black, sitting in a PhD class, dozen, 15 of us, and he was talking about theology and this kind of stuff. Matthew's good guy. And I forget what the subject was, but he told us a story about his experience in World War II in France. He was a Church of Scotland man, trained because he knew he was going to be a pastor and a preacher and a teacher. And he said in the middle of the war, he got in a firefight and he dove into a culvert. And a German soldier came into the culvert on the other end at the same time. And Matthew said, I got the man first. And I shot him. He said, I know the instant I did it that I was wrong. And then, he literally was like, Don, you've been a Mennonite, and Mennonites have a peace position where, I'm quoting him, it's not mine, where in the hell have you been? Maybe somebody's going to ask us that someday. Where have we been? Is this something that's in our DNA? So if you're a Mennonite and you're passive, you can't help it. No. How do we bring alive the teachings of Jesus into a world that says, that's not the way to solve problems? I can say, how do you know that?
I'm always really challenged by this. I'm new to the Mennonite Church. I'm always challenged by perspective. A lot of my ties and family are in African American communities. And so I think a lot about violence from the perspective of the oppressed part of that formula. And I think about when we speak to Martin Luther King, oftentimes when we talk about Black history, when we talk about nonviolence and civil disobedience, and I'm aware of the fact that this all occurred in the same context where there was a Black Power movement, and there was an FBI, and there was COINTELPRO. There was enough concern over effective, violent, revolutionary action that occurred right alongside of the nonviolence that was effective to a degree. And so I'm always thinking about this question from the perspective of the person that, say, the Jew in Palestine, right, under Roman occupation, and really trying to not see it from the perspective of a powerful person who has everything at my disposal to choose whether or not to be violent. And that's probably taking a little bit far, because there's a choice.
I think I'm with you if I'm hearing you right. But what I would like to see, there's a tendency for people like me to once a war starts saying, hey, you shouldn't do that, it's wrong, we're wrong, and not have started 10 years ago looking at a witness to what are we doing in race relations that's going to erupt 5 years down the road somewhere here in town. And my Christian egotism says, if we claim to have the Holy Spirit's presence among us, we ought to have some insight into what our actions are leading us to become, and not just reaction. So that we need to find earlier on a positive way to become involved in that issue so it doesn't erupt into abusive oppression. Back in slave days, unfortunately, it was the church who were the slave owners, the Christian people, and it erupted in that process. Does that make sense? And how do we work at proactive peacemaking in times of peace?
Make maybe three connected brief comments and reflect on them. One of the things I learned also from John Paul Lederach, who I think is one of our best, is the progression conflict resolution, which assumes a kind of definitive answer, but often ends up with one side winning over the other. To conflict mediation, which often leads to a kind of compromise of how to get along. To conflict transformation, which is always a living, ongoing process. So I'm fully in agreement with what you're calling us to, like the language of conflict transformation.
Yes, that's the new, better language. See, conflict mediation tends to think, well, once there's conflict, we'll try to solve it. When here, conflict transformation is trying to say, how do we use conflict before it happens as a way of building relationships for which conflict doesn't become a controlling factor. Yeah.
The second comment is, I also believe very strongly we have to spend more time and energy on teaching nonviolence and nonviolent direct action and so on in our churches.
But do it creatively.
Yes.
Do it creatively.
I forget what the third something about.
Maybe this is just showing my age, but there's this whole concept of the quiet in the land.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's not doing us a disservice at this point. We are so proud of being humble. And I have been saying for years that I don't understand why when people, the general population hears the word Christian, they think fundamentalists, which is much of what you've mentioned as well. Where are we? Why? What is it about us that makes us say that what we have to say is not worth saying? I don't understand.
I don't want to answer that. I want to make an observation. My experience is persons like me at times tends to be almost violent in the language I use to explain to you why you want to be a peacemaker. That we can be aggressive, painfully aggressive at times, in the way in which we communicate with my Baptist lawyer friend. I go home sometimes and say, I wish I would have said that. How do we allow peacemaking just to emote out of who we are rather than to declare who we are? I think if we have to say who we are, we kind of halfway lost who we are. Because we have to explain it. And if we are who we are, we'll show it. That's innocent, naive, but that's, I believe.
Do you believe that the end of the draft was the beginning of the weakening of our disposition?
Yes. And I'm sorry about that. I feel badly about it because we tend, historically, we tend to respond very well when the pressure is put on us. But when the pressure is taken away, then the need for teaching we thought was taken away. And we were not prepared for the next round coming up.
I have more of a comment, I guess. The first is that the way you look at this is very refreshing to me. I've sort of shied away from the Bible because I felt backed into a corner of how I was supposed to read it. And the comment I was going to make is that I completely agree that the way we can work on peace is starting in our own little world, connecting. But I have a really hard time going from agreeing with this and then finding ways to maybe connect with my Muslim brother and sister or vets when they're not really in my normal circle. So that's just a comment because I agree with that and I just have a hard time making the jump of finding ways to do that.
Touche. Good, a really good comment. And I'm aware of it and I will plead guilty, but we all do it, so I get to do it too. I can come in here and make nice pronouncements and then fly southwest home. And hope you do so. It becomes one of the exciting roles of church leadership and church membership to together figure out what can we do. For example, at College Church, we have a number of sociologists, we have a number of economists, and they keep saying, hey, we ought to be doing this with this community. We tend to say, well, yeah, but, you know, I assume there are voices in the community that can identify, there's something we could do, and there's something we could do. And it may take discernment in the community to figure out what it is possible for us to do well, rather than doing everything badly. But you're just, yeah, you are smack right now. Yeah.
One thing that we used to do here at the church, and this is when the draft was in existence, is the young people went through a training program to take up a peace position. And I know our son went through that a second time when he was even older, when the draft was not in existence. And that's something I think the church still should do here. Take with our young people, they should go through a process of developing a peace ethic, a stance, as if the draft were in existence.
I want to comment on one end of that. Would it be fair or kind for me to say you ought to go through that too again? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's pray. Lord, honest to goodness, we try. We want to be a people in whom your presence and grace and love is seen and known and felt. Not just within our own hearts, but in the lives of people around us. We would pray, Lord, that we might be a people who, when others feel stressed and hurt and hungry, can say, we can go there. They'd help us. We pray, Lord, for wisdom, for understanding. For an understanding that crosses the kind of paraffin barriers that we have around us, that helps us to see and feel as other people see and feel. We are grateful for so many things.